The Serbian government says its offer for open, unconditional talks with the Albanians still stands. But Albanian leaders have snubbed the Serb delegates twice and are expected to do so again on Monday. Albanians are demanding freedom from Serb rule. Tens of thousands of protesters marched peacefully through the streets of Pristina Friday, calling on the international community to intervene. And joining us now from New York to talk more about the crisis and the U.S. congressional debate on Kosovo policy is former Congressman Joseph DioGuardi. Mr. DioGuardi is also president of the Albanian American Civic League. Mr. DioGuardi, we're hearing mixed reports. Earlier we heard that it was relatively quiet, and now we're hearing there are mixed instances of some violence. Have you heard from any of the people back there?
In fact, just on the way down to your studios here in New York, I received a call, and I was told that fighting started again in the village of Lyusha, which is one of the 4 villages in this Stranica region. So I think we're going to see a continuation of this. You know, we've seen how Mr. Milosevic responds because of our experience in Bosnia. Unless the West is prepared to take swift action, I've heard the strong words in Congress and Mrs. Madeleine Albright's strong words, but unless we're prepared to take swift action, you will not see Mr. Milosevic back off.
What do you mean by swift action?
Well, we just had a congressional hearing, and I was delighted to see that a hearing that was called on Bosnia, and it was because in great part of the efforts of our Albanian American Civic League that we shifted the emphasis of that hearing to Kosovo. And there was a lot of tough talk from Ambassador Gelbard and from the administration. But talk does not work. In terms of swift action, we need to do what we did in Bosnia 2 years too late.
In other words, you're talking about military.
Well, we need to establish a no-fly zone immediately. We know that they're using heavily armed helicopters. There's no reason for that kind of force to be used against innocent civilians. We should be ringing the border of Yugoslavia right now with NATO troops in Macedonia, in Bulgaria, in Montenegro. There's no reason why we shouldn't show Mr. Milosevic that the West is resolved to see this conflict contained and to see the political rights of the Albanian people, long-suffering Albanian people of Kosovo, finally addressed.
In your view, where is the holdup? Is it in Congress or elsewhere?
Well, it appears that our State Department is thinking long and hard about the actions. We like the tone of the statements made by the Secretary of State and by Ambassador Gelbard, but there should be no secret as to what works with Mr. Milosevic. In fact, he should be on the list of war criminals in The Hague. Why we have embraced the person who started the Balkan conflict back in Kosovo in 1989, the war in Slovenia in 1991, and then Croatia, and then Bosnia, and put him at the peace table at the Dayton Accords, I don't know. It was Congressman Dana Rohrabacher who said to Ambassador Gelbard, is Mr. Milosevic, and he said it euphemistically, on the list of war criminals, and Gelbard said no, and then Rohrabacher says, but we're dealing with all of his buddies who are war criminals, Mr. Karadzic, Mr. Milosevic. We have to understand that you cannot trust Mr. Milosevic. Look at his actions, and you'll see what he's about to do in Kosovo.
Okay, I can tell you this, that the Pentagon is saying now that absolutely no consideration is being given to sending in troops either from Canada or the United States.
Well, we already have a force in Macedonia. I can't believe that they're not considering right now to expand that force, that protection force made up now of U.S. troops and Norwegian troops. I believe it totals about 600. It seems to me that the only answer right now is to show resolve. We didn't show it for 2 years in Bosnia, and we lost 200,000 people, and we had a conflagration there second to none.
Let me ask you this. The ministers of the European Union are suggesting that further sanctions should be imposed in Belgrade. Is that going to work?
Sanctions don't seem to work with Mr. Milosevic. That's what the hearing was all about. We did get a very tough resolution. It was made even tougher because of the efforts of the Albanian American Civic League that represents the concerns of 400,000 ethnic Albanians here in America. But sanctions will not be enough. We need to show resolve. We should move an aircraft carrier off the coast of Montenegro. Let it stay there. We should ring Serbia with troops. Let them stay there. If we see one move, and don't forget, Ralph, 2 presidents drew a line in the sand. President Bush on the way out and President Clinton on the way in said if there's any military or paramilitary action in Kosovo, we would move swiftly. That question was put to Mr. Gelbard, Ambassador Gelbard, and he said that foreign policy declaration is still in effect.
Do you think that kind of activity worked in Bosnia?
Absolutely. The only time we saw the Serbian regime come to the table to try to resolve something was when they knew the West was ready to act.
We only have a few more moments. Let me ask you this. It's to many people, it's a very, very confusing story, and you have to go back into history. How did the ethnic Albanians get into the situation in the first place?
It is a very confusing story, but let me say this. The ethnic Albanians of Kosova were there for over 5,000 years. You can't believe the Serbian propaganda machine. They did not move to Kosova or Macedonia or Montenegro. This is one half of the divided nation of Albanians. You have 3.5 million Albanians in the state of Albania and 3.5 just outside its borders. Okay. And they were there.
Joseph DioGuardi, thank you very much for sharing your views and perspective with us today.
Thank you.
This is CNN International.
Well, here in the CNN Center, we continue to track the situation that appears to be heating up in Kosova, that is a province of Serbia. The U.S. is describing the situation as troubling and extremely dangerous. Yugoslavia is reported to be building up its forces in the province, even as the U.S. and its allies on the so-called contact group are considering additional sanctions against Belgrade. Joining us for further insight into the story, Congressman Benjamin Gilman. He is chairman of the U.S. House of Representatives International Relations Committee. Thank you for joining us, Representative Gilman.
Jim, thank you for having us today.
This is a situation that by the hour this day appears to have grown more serious. How do you think the Congress reads it in terms of sanctions, in terms of resolving this dispute?
Well, it's a very critical issue. It's been growing rapidly over the last few days. I think Congress recognizes the seriousness, and I'm pleased now the State Department has come along to recognize it. Just today, they issued a statement that the U.S. has made it clear that Milosevic that we reject his assertion that Kosovo is an internal issue. It's not an internal issue. Human rights are involved. The entire region's involved. We could be back to a world conflict unless we do something immediately.
All right, now talking about sanctions, Serbia's foreign minister, Yugoslavia's foreign minister has made it clear that if they are pressed, if they are pressured on the issue of Kosovo, there could be a retreat of cooperation in terms of the Dayton Peace Accords in Bosnia. How is that going to play?
Well, Milosevic has left a lot to be desired with regard to his cooperation on Bosnia. Milosevic, as you know, has been condemned as a war criminal, and once again he's showing his disdain for human rights. And that's why the State Department has issued this statement today. You know, Milosevic hardline policies were not successful in Slovenia and Croatia, Bosnia, and now once again he's started a problem in Kosovo. He's trying to impose his will on over 2 million Albanians, where they have a very minor population of Serbs. And it's time that we reminded Mr. Milosevic that he has to recognize their rights. And this is not just an internal matter. It's a matter affecting the entire region, could affect the entire world.
The U.S. obviously cannot go it alone. If it were to come to increased sanctions, they would need the cooperation. At the same time, we're hearing rumblings. If they don't get that cooperation, particularly from the contact group in the former Yugoslavia, the U.S. may be prepared to pull out of that contact group. What do you hear?
Well, it's not a matter of pulling out, but the U.S. has indicated that we would assert our own independent initiatives in the event that the contact group cannot be convinced to do something important about stemming the violence and hostility in Kosovo.
Congress has been anything but eager to see troops remain in Bosnia without the threat of a military action to back up the sanctions. What real credibility will this move have?
I think there'd be a lot of credibility because Congress is concerned about the loss of life and the hostility and the oppression being asserted by Mr. Milosevic.
Do you think that the U.S. Congress would be prepared to back a military intervention if it came to that, or to at least back up the sanctions with the threat of military force?
I think Congress is prepared to undertake some more forceful initiatives that have been undertaken to date to try to bring peace to this part of the world. Otherwise, we may be facing hostility that would flow beyond the borders of Albania and Kosovo.
But as has been seen so many times in the past, particularly in Bosnia, unless there was the use of military force, the threat of military force, there was no movement on the ground in terms of the political situation, was there?
Regrettably, Mr. Milosevic doesn't understand peaceful initiatives unless there is some more powerful threat to support those initiatives.
And you think the support is there in Congress for that?
I think Congress would react favorably to try to make certain that we bring peace once again to that part of the world.
All right, back to sanctions. What specific sanctions do you believe would have an effect for at least underlining the need for more autonomy for Kosovo?
Well, you know, the arms embargo, I think, would have very little effect on Mr. Milosevic, as well as economic sanctions. However, I think the State Department's proposal to freeze the assets of the Serbs, hundreds of millions of dollars around the world, may have an important impact upon President Milosevic.
Well, as the situation is moving very rapidly on the ground, we heard there from CNN's Brent Sadler reporting from Belgrade about reinforcements being sent up by the Serb or Yugoslav side. At the same time, the Albanians have been moving their forces onto a higher state of alert along the border with Kosovo. Is the time right for a warning to Tirana, to the Albanians, to ratchet down the tension?
Well, you know, the Albanians are essentially placed in a position where they're trying to defend themselves from all of the hostility that's taken place. Mr. Milosevic has moved in troops into the hostile area. Artillery has been at work at night. We have reports of artillery being fired throughout the night. Villages are being damaged, and there's been a considerable loss of life. So I think to ratchet down the Albanians, I think that's up to Mr. Milosevic to ratchet down his hostile attitude.
All right, we've been talking with Representative Benjamin Gilman. He is chairman of the House International Relations Committee and a Republican from New York. Thanks so much for being with us.
Good being with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll call this hearing to order. We expect the arrival of some other senators soon when their conferences, lunches break up. But we welcome you all. Today, the Foreign Relations Committee has convened to discuss the crisis in Kosovo and its potential ramifications on stability throughout the region.
Don't you think Slobodan Milosevic is hearing those responses? Don't you think he's ready to do more and more because he sees that the greatest superpower in the world has lost its resolve, has a foreign policy which has abandoned the principles upon which this country was formed? Our foreign policy should be based on fundamental human rights. That's one of the key determinants of foreign policy. We have today in Kosovo some of the most egregious examples of violations of those human rights. In fact, Senator Biden, during that hearing that you held, and it was a wonderful hearing, it was the first time that you got all groups together to talk about the problem, I had to fly in reports from the Council on Human Rights from Pristina and other places, litanies of horror. I don't have to do that today. You know why? All you have to do is read your own U.S. country report from the State Department. Here it is, the 1997 edition. But if you read the last 5 years, you can't believe the litany of horrors in here against the Albanian people of Kosovo. What are we waiting for? How many people have been killed and brutally tortured and detained and disappeared? Every criteria they use has been violated. Why is there such a disconnect between those egregious violations and our professed adherence to human rights when it comes to foreign policy? Is there another deal in the wind? Perhaps you didn't ask the right questions to Ambassador Gelbard. Are we placating Russia for some reason? They're always there supporting their first cousins, the Serbs. That's where the Serbs came from in the 6th century AD, from the Ukraine. We know they're blood brothers, or at least blood cousins. They're always there supporting them. But what has Russia done for us in Iran, Iraq, and China, and so many other places? They don't support us. Why are we giving such deference to Russia? Why are we even considering a contact group at this point, including Russia? This is an issue that should be led by the United States of America in the NATO milieu, without Russia. This is where it belongs. That is what solved Bosnia. And the only reason today Bosnia is not like Kosova, Mr. Chairman and Senator, is that we have troops there. Who are we kidding? When are we going to wake up? And what's wrong with a national liberation movement, Senator, when there's no one there to defend you? What's wrong with that? What are they going to wait for? There are many articles written about when enough is enough. And there was one just recently that I read by a professor from Tufts University. His name is Hurst Honnett. And he said there are two instances in which secession, I'm not saying that they're saying that, but even secession, as we did 221 years ago, should be supported by the international community. The first occurs when massive, discriminatory human rights violations approaching the scale of genocide are being perpetrated. If there is no likelihood of a change in the attitude of the central government, or if the majority population supports the repression, as we just saw in that phony referendum that Slobodan Milosevic just held in Serbia, he doesn't want any international intervention. Secession may be the only effective remedy for the besieged group. This is international law. A second possible exception might find a right of secession if reasonable demands for local self-government or minority rights have been arbitrarily rejected by a central government, even without accompanying large-scale violence. And it goes on. So this is not an easy issue. It wasn't easy in 1991. It's not easy today. But let's not brand the victims as the terrorists. Let's not talk about Greater Albania, because that's not on the table. What's on the table constantly for 50 years, certainly in the last 10, is the quest for Greater Serbia, and we seem very willing to give Mr. Milosevic what he wants. I hope we're not going to do the same in Kosova as we did in Bosnia. It would be a tragedy of the highest proportions, and I think it would only lead to a very destabilized Balkans and a greater war later on. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, when Serbian President Milosevic promised to work with Albanian leaders in Kosovo, the White House lifted sanctions on Serbia. Milosevic then proceeded to slaughter thousands of ethnic Albanians, many of them helpless women and children. Milosevic is a liar. Milosevic is a brutal killer. And ethnic cleansing has reared its ugly head once again. Milosevic must be challenged. The United States should reimpose strict sanctions on Serbia, and it's time for Europe to stop cuddling this bum. I believe Milosevic must be made to understand that Albanian children are God's children too. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields the balance of his time.
Nightmare in the Balkans. Refugees from Kosovo, but what are Europe's options for ending their misery? Hello everyone, welcome to CNN's interactive news program Q&A. Kosovo, Serbia's small but independence-minded province, is in flames. Battles between Serbian security forces and rebels show no sign of abating. The people continue to flee, while the international community, the US, the European Union, NATO and Kosovo's neighbors try to figure out where to go from here. Joseph DioGuardi is president of the Albanian American Civic League. He's a former US congressman who's now lobbying Washington to put the squeeze on Yugoslav's president Slobodan Milosevic. Mohamed Kaplani was Albania's foreign minister following the fall of communism. He says that the international community must act swiftly before it's too late. And from London, we're joined by Noel Malcolm, author of Kosovo, A Short History. He says that the bloodshed in Kosovo has much larger implications for the region, but especially for Macedonia. Joe DioGuardi, let me start with you. You're lobbying the U.S. administration on Kosovo. Where does the issue appear on the list of the U.S. administration's priorities in the first place?
First, let me say that I'm the volunteer president of the Albanian American Civic League, the only registered lobby of the Albanian people here in America, representing the concerns and interests of some 400,000 Albanian Americans, and Kosova is at the top of our list. I try to go to Washington as much as I can. I was there yesterday to speak in front of the Institute of Peace. There were many people from the State Department there to let them know that our foreign policy is a mess, it's failing, that they have blood on their hands. Mr. Holbrooke has blood on his hands. NATO has already discredited itself. We've been through this before. We saw it in Bosnia. We diddled, waffled, and dawdled for 3 years, saying that nothing could be done, and then finally, we couldn't take the bloodshed anymore after seeing Srebrenica and the Market Square in Sarajevo. We're seeing it right now in Kosova, and we acted.
Okay, I'm going to get on to our first caller who's standing with a call already from London. Malika, your question, please.
All right, my question is for Mr. DioGuardi, and I would like the same question for Mr. Malcolm. I would like to know how far international community is going to with the efforts to bring this crisis to an end, and when the international community will realize that the best solution to the Kosovo crisis is by recognition to the Kosovo independence.
Right. Let me get to Noel Malcolm first on this, just to give London a chance there. Go ahead, Noel.
Well, the question asks me to make a prediction, and I don't think I can do that. I can agree with some of the basic premises of that question. I think a solution, a real final solution for this problem will only come when the Western governments recognize that some sort of independence for Kosovo must be the long-term option. And that's the basic problem with all their policy so far. They have military power. They don't know what policy to use military power for. It makes no sense to go in and fight Milosevic's forces, and then when you've won that little war, you turn around to the local Albanians and say, right, now you go back under Belgrade as autonomous subjects of Yugoslavia. So there is no coherent policy, and cannot be a coherent policy for military action until they have taken that vital step diplomatically of recognizing that independence makes sense as a long-term goal.
Well, Joseph DioGuardi, let's get your quick response to that too.
Well, I definitely agree with Noel. Independence is the only option. It's the one that was selected by the Albanian people of Kosovo in 1992 when they had a referendum. They selected independence. A bill was introduced last week by Congressman Jim Traficant, making a prima facie case that Kosovo meets all of the indicia under international law for independence as a nation. So why is our State Department saying that independence is off the table? That is what's causing this battle to go on and no dialogue to begin.
Bassam in London's been hanging on for a while. Go ahead, Bassam, your question, please.
Hi, my question is why when the Serbs cracked down in Kosovo, everyone was a lot of promises, so it's not going to repeat another Bosnia. So what is this promises now? What is a Bosnia was different than Kosovo is now?
Joseph DioGuardi, what do you think?
Well, it's obvious that there is no difference. The only difference between Bosnia and Kosovo right now is that we have troops in Bosnia. That's why it's not falling apart. And we don't have troops in Kosovo. We have to show resolve with Mr. Milosevic. We know his modus operandi, his M.O. When he senses waffling, when he senses some indecision, he tends to move. Don't forget, his biggest concern is his political base in Belgrade. He's a Stalinist communist. He's lied to the people of Serbia. He controls all the media. And what he wants to do is to increase his own power there, and he's using the blood of the Albanian people in Kosovo. It's a mess, and the only one that can resolve this right now is the only superpower to do it, the United States of America. And we've got to get Madeleine Albright talking tough again, and she should not be muffled by Sandy Berger. And Mr. Holbrooke has blood on his hands for dealing with Mr. Milosevic. He's a war criminal, and he's got to be treated that way.
I'm going to get to a question that's going on our internet chat room as we go out live. It says, why hasn't Albania jumped in and helped their fellow Albanians? Mohammed Kaplani, I guess that would be best for you.
Well, I would say that the Albanians feel that they are the brothers in the Republic of Albania, and Albanians everywhere in the world, they think that their brothers in Kosovo are fighting for a just cause, and they support them, and they will continue to support them, and it will be ready someday, as some of them are doing, even to fight alongside their brothers, their kinsmen.
I'd like to comment on that, Riza.
Go ahead.
On the way down, on my cellular phone, I received a call from one of our contacts in Albania, and as we're speaking, the Albanian parliament is meeting, and it's significant that I was told that the socialists are now joining with the opposition to mobilize the army, and they've ordered Fatos Nano, the prime minister, who, by the way, is vacationing in Greece, of all places, for the Albanians, and to get back to Tirana. So what I'm saying is that this could be our worst fears being confirmed, that this will now spread into a Balkan war, and that's why our foreign policy here is failing.
And Joe, how reliable are your sources on that information?
Well, they were watching Today TV in Tirana, and this was going on as he was calling me on the phone.
Let's get to Sweden. Antonio has a question. Go ahead, Antonio.
I'm sorry, you are totally wrong, because I know the region, and I know that you are totally wrong.
In what way, Antonio?
You have provoked a solution to force the United States to come in. And the United States didn't understand that they were going to a hole. You have not the right, internationally speaking, of claiming for independence.
Okay, Noel Malcolm. Okay, Noel Malcolm, let's get you in.
People have that
right.
On that.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Yes, on this question of the legal right to claim independence, there is a very clear legal case. Kosovo was, in Tito's Yugoslavia, in his constitutions, Kosovo was one of the units of the federal system. And what happened in 1991 and 92 was that the whole federal Yugoslavia dissolved into its constituent units. That is how it was officially analyzed and recognized by the Western governments. Now, if Kosovo was one of those constituent units, and any constitutional lawyer who looks at that constitution will tell you that it was, it follows that it also has the right to seek independence.
Joe DioGuardi, let me get a question into you. You spoke earlier about the Sarajevo marketplace bombing and how that jolted people into action. This email question from Lahore in Pakistan, Farhana Sayed says, if reports of mass graves had been confirmed, would the EU and NATO be more likely to act then?
I believe they already know there are mass graves. Don't forget what happened 3 years ago. Our State Department covered up. They knew there were mass graves. That's why several senior officials resigned. This is a moral issue right now, and it's outrageous. In fact, an article was just written by our Balkan Affairs advisor, Shirley Cloyes, of the Albanian American Civic League, and she quotes Congressman Lantos, who knows oppression. He was someone who was saved from the Nazi Holocaust, and he goes, quote, "We have a moral obligation to identify with the people of Kosova. They have been persecuted, discriminated against, and killed by a police state. Kosovo Albanians have suffered enough." That's Tom Lantos in the House of Representatives on March 12th. There's no question there are mass graves there. We just don't want to admit it because we're not willing to show resolve. That's the only way we're going to solve this.
London on the line. Surinder's on the line. Go ahead, Surinder. I understand you're 13 years old.
Hi. I'd like to ask Mr. DioGuardi, why is NATO formed, and how many children have to be killed for the NATO to take action?
Joe DioGuardi.
Well, this is a question I hear all the time from the Albanian people. How many hundreds of thousands of Albanians should be killed before the West acts, before the United States acts? It took 300,000 Bosnians. We have to ask our State Department and the rest of the world, how many Albanians have to be killed before you act?
Let's get Jenny on the line from England. Go ahead, Jenny.
Yes, hello. My question is, have the KLA been significantly weakened by the recent Serb offensive, and do you believe the KLA will become an important military factor in the future?
Let me ask Mohammed Kaplani to answer that one, please.
Yes, I do strongly believe that the KLA is already a force to reckon with, a strong military force, and it is going to be stronger and stronger because they are fighting for independence. They are fighting to put an end to atrocities, to centuries-long and to decades-long atrocities by the Serbs. And I'm sure that the KLA, if there is no independence so far, KLA is going to fight, the Albanians are going to support it, Albanians everywhere, because this cannot go on forever.
Well, I was going to ask you
not to let the Albanians at the mercy of the murderers.
Well, I was going to ask you, Mohammed Kaplani, about the problem that there seems to be divisions within the Kosovar leadership on the ethnic Albanian side in the first place, which seems to hamper any diplomatic effort.
Well, I can see that the KLA is doing pretty well in the field, and they have no misunderstandings. They have no strong contradictions. When it comes to fighting, when it comes to talking, maybe they do not quite see things in the same light, because talking to Milosevic at this time without having the Serbs moving out, without the withdrawal of the Serbs, there's no point in talking about negotiations.
And Riz, whatever their difference is, everyone to a person wants independence, and they're all together on that.
All right, let's get a quick call in from Switzerland. Eileen, your question brief, please, because we've only got a minute left.
Yeah, can I do the question?
Please, yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Mr. DioGuardi has often repeated that American administration has failed in Balkan. So I want to ask, if exists any possibility for solution to save Albanians, to save Kosovo, and to put peace in Balkan? This is my question.
Well, the only way to do it is what we did 3 years too late in Bosnia. We have to take the lead. We have to show Mr. Milosevic that there is pain he has to take for his actions. Sanctions will not work. We have seen this over and over again. Only the credible threat of force or the use of it. And that doesn't mean that we have to commit U.S. troops to Kosova. As we saw in Bosnia 3 years later, 3 years after we should have acted, we did some surgical things, military actions that sent the signal that the time was up for Mr. Milosevic, and he backed off. We have to do the same things now.
Well, no, Malcolm, a final comment with 30 seconds to go. You mentioned sanctions. What about the prospect of military action now? We're seeing military exercises nearby. What do you think is going to be the next step?
Well, I'm afraid if you ask me what I really think is going on in the NATO government's minds, it's still just saber-rattling, because they don't have a coherent policy for the long term. Their idea is they're obsessed with not talking about independence because of fears that it would spark off some breakaway movement in Macedonia. The biggest problem is exactly that the present policy will undermine Macedonia, because the present policy guarantees that this war will continue.
No, Malcolm, I want to thank you. We've run out of time. Thanks very much. And Joseph DioGuardi, thanks very much for joining us there in New York. And of course, Mohamed Kaplani, a big thanks to you as well there.
More on the situation in Albania and in neighboring Kosovo. We're turning now to Joseph DioGuardi. He is a former U.S. Congressman who is now the volunteer president of the Albanian American Civil League. When you look at the instability that Albania once again trying to endure, what are your concerns? How seriously do you view this political rivalry?
Well, it's very serious, Jim, and thanks for having me on the program. I just returned from Albania 2 weeks ago with our Balkan Affairs advisor, Shirley Cloyes, and one of the last things we did before coming back was have dinner, a very private dinner, with Sali Berisha, Peter Abnori, the former chairman of the parliament, and Azim Haidari. What's happening right now, Jim, is not a coup d'etat. This is the propaganda of the nano government. It's being parroted by many Western governments. This is a people's uprising. That's what it is. You know what led to Azim Haidari's death? The day before he was executed, assassinated, by well-known criminals, by the way, who sought refuge in the Ministry of Interior right afterwards, he had exposed on opposition radio the exact locations of Greek and Serbian intelligence operatives. These are people who are working with the nano government. The Albanian people are fed up. They don't want foreign policy for Albania to be made in Greece. In fact, today at those rallies, I've called my friends, and the people are chanting, Nano, you are Greek, not Albanian. They're saying that because he spends more time in Greece than he does in Tirana, listening to what they want. They're also saying, Nano, you're a thief. Where are you hiding? We still don't have the money back from our the pyramid schemes. You promised us when you were elected you'd return the money. Here in the Wall Street Journal, just in August, we have an article that we can't even find. There are accountants, Pete, Mark, and Mitchell, they can't even find any of the money that was frozen when Nano came in, and he promised the Albanian people, that's how he got elected, that he would return all this money.
All right, Joseph, obviously you have some sympathies with the Democratic Party of Sali Berisha as you follow all of this for whatever reason. I'm not saying that they're not good reasons, but of course the people of Albania were very upset with Sali Berisha. He's one of the people that was seen to be backing some of these pyramid schemes. It is the lack of perhaps control, the lack of stability in Albania, in any one of these governments that has created this crisis, isn't it?
Well, listen, you know, when you look at a government that came out of 50 years of the worst communism the world has seen, and I was with you there in 1991, Jim, I remember, during those elections, you have to understand that mistakes can be made. Sali Berisha was not perfect, He didn't have all the answers, but that was a democratically elected government. The real coup is not happening right now. It happened in 1997 when NATO used criminal elements in Vlora, in the southern part of Albania, to kill Democrat Party officials so they couldn't be even posted in the elections. I was there during those elections. I mean, we've got to understand what's really going on today, and the people are fed up. There's no question that Salih Berisha made mistakes, but what's going on right now is a veiled attempt to destroy democracy totally. There is no opposition right now without Dr. Salih Berisha. And I'll say this to Mr. Nano. Obviously, he just withdrew by the Albanian-controlled parliament Salih Berisha's immunity. This, I believe, is a transparent step just before they're going to arrest Salih Berisha. I can tell you on behalf of 400,000 Albanian Americans, if Salih Berisha is arrested by NATO, you can be sure that very shortly thereafter, there will be members of the Senate and members of the House on the floor asking for the resignation of Fatos Nano.
Now, that's the political situation as we look at it in Albania today. The risk, one of the potential risks here is we have a very destabilizing situation just across the border, perhaps a humanitarian nightmare about to play out in the Serbian province of Kosova, 90% ethnic Albanians. Could the political crisis in Tirana spill over one way or another here into Kosovo?
It already has. I went there specifically to go to the northern part of Albania to witness firsthand this humanitarian tragedy. Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, who was going to come with me, was intimidated not to come because of reports of terrorism. I still went and took a helicopter up there to go around. What you have to understand, Jim, is that what's happening in Kosova is a result of what's happening in Tirana. Salih Berisha was removed because he would not be a puppet of this failed foreign policy in the United States. The United States now has, the State Department has 3 puppets, or at least 2. We have one, Fatos Nano in Albania, and we have Milosevic in Serbia, a reputed war criminal who right now has been at least indicted, or at least there's a sense of the Congress that he should be indicted, because we have a Senate resolution and a House resolution that he is a war criminal, and yet we have Mr. Holbrooke and Mr. Gelbard doing business with him. This is what's causing the problem in Kosovo. The people of Kosovo want freedom. They want independence. They don't want to be under the boot of another Nazi regime. That's what they have in Milosevic. And Mr. Nano speaks to Milosevic and speaks to the Greek Prime Minister and Foreign Minister every day. So we've got a complete manipulation of the Albanian people in Kosovo and in Albania, and this is not right. And if it's not resolved, you will see a Balkan war second to none, and it'll stem from the failed policies of the Clinton administration.
All right, certainly partisan, but certainly informed. Joseph DioGuardi, as always, thank you much for your perspectives.
Thank you, Jim.
The gentleman from New York, what purpose does he rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and agree to House Concurrent Resolution 315 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 315, concurrent resolution expressing the sense of the Congress, condemning the atrocities by Serbian police and military forces against Albanians in Kosova, and urging that blocked assets of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro, under control of the United States and other governments, be used to compensate the Albanians in Kosova for losses suffered through Serbian police and military action.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Gilman, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Lantos, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I ask consent to revise and extend my remarks, and all members may have 5 days within which to revise and extend their remarks on this measure. And Mr. Speaker, this resolution, H. Conres 315, expresses a well-founded view that Serbia is responsible for the mayhem that police and military personnel have inflicted upon the unfortunate people of Kosovo, and that Serbia should be held financially responsible for the damages done to their homes and other property of the Albanian citizens of Kosovo. I commend the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Lantos, a senior member of our committee, for introducing this measure, and I'm pleased to be listed as an original co-sponsor. This resolution calls for our President to work with the Congress to develop laws and regulations that would make it possible to utilize such Serbian blocked assets here in our nation under the control of our government for the purpose of providing restitution to those who have suffered property losses as a result of the conflict in Kosova. And while we recognize that there may be other claimants to these assets, we want to put the House on record that Serbia is financially accountable for the damages that its police and military have caused through unrestrained use of force and the willful destruction of housing and other property belonging to members of the Albanian community in Kosova. Just last week, I called upon the President to mobilize NATO to issue an ultimatum to Milosevic to permit the hundreds of thousands of displaced people in Kosova to return to their homes in safety and to permit unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance for these people. Winter comes early to Kosova. We can no longer play for time for other forms of diplomacy to take effect. Milosevic is completely untrustworthy, and the lives of more than 250,000 people in Kosova now hang on the credibility of the international community's pledge to permit no more Bosnians in the Balkans. We must not wait to act until scenes of human misery flash across our TV screens in the next few weeks. Accordingly, I urge our members, all of our members of the House, to join with the sponsors of this resolution in sending a strong message to the Serbian leadership that in addition to any legal and political penalties they may face, they'll also pay a financial penalty for their actions in Kosova. It's our hope that other governments will undertake similar measures so that the people of Kosova may eventually receive some restitution from the government that is directly responsible for their suffering and for their tremendous losses. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me first express my thanks and respect to the gentleman from New York, chairman of our committee, for his strong support of this long overdue measure. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, I would like to put this whole resolution in some historic context. Kosova, the Albanian province of Serbia, was a relatively peaceful, poor place until 1989. In 1989, without the slightest provocation, Mr. Milosevic destroyed whatever modicum of autonomy the people of Kosovo had and created of 1,800,000 Albanian ethnic Kosovars, colonial subjects within their own country. Now, I visited Kosovo many times during the last decade. It is, without any question, Europe's poorest region. It is the only region, Mr. Speaker, where you can meet a young man or a young woman in their 20s having only 1 or 2 or 3 teeth because there are no dental services available. The grinding poverty of the Albanian ethnic population of Kosovo is pitiful and heartrending. The people of Kosovo have been fortunate to have reasonable, moderate, peace-loving leadership in the person of Dr. Ibrahim Rugova, a scholar of great distinction. But he couldn't get any place with the dictatorial regime of Milosevic. And gradually, an extremist element emerged within the Albanian population, which started military activities. In response to this, the Serbian army not only crushed this military uprising, but caused over 250,000 civilians, men, women, children, old folks, to leave their poor villages, many of them by now destroyed. As we speak, Mr. Speaker, over 50,000 civilian Kosovars are hiding in the mountains. And last week, the first snow fell in Kosovo. My resolution calls for two things. It calls for the Congress to denounce the brutal and inhumane activities of Serbian military and paramilitary and police forces against the civilian population of Kosovo. And secondly, it calls on our government to see to it that Serbian assets frozen in this country be used to compensate, to whatever extent is feasible, these poor and destitute people, so that when they return to their destroyed and devastated villages, they can start rebuilding their lives. This is the very least that we can do for an innocent, persecuted, long-suffering people. 1,800,000 ethnic Albanian Kosovars whose sole crime is that they happen to live within the boundaries of the state of Serbia. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time. I don't have any further requests for speaker.
The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield to my friend and colleague from Ohio, my distinguished colleague, Congressman Traficant, as much time as he might choose to consume.
I want to thank the distinguished member and for sponsoring this legislation I'm a co-sponsor of, and for his leadership throughout the world for freedom. I think if there's someday a dictionary and encyclopedia and says, what's a congressman look like? You see Bill Natcher and Tom Lantos. I mean that. Thank you for the time. And Chairman, thank you for all the work you've done. Naturally, I support this resolution. I think it's on target. I, though, would also like to recommend that my legislation that would move Kosovo towards an independent state be seriously considered for several reasons. Number one, Milosevic has shown that he is a brutal dictator, and the atrocities against ethnic Albanians may in fact produce another Bosnia for the world. Having said that, I think it's time to look at Kosovo. Population consists of 90% ethnic Albanians. Their roots, their language, and under the former state of Yugoslavia, they had an independent status. As much as I support this, I'd like to say that ethnic Albanians do not just want an opportunity to make a claim against Serbian assets in our country. Ethnic Albanians want independence, and they are crying out for freedom all over this world. I believe our administration is trying to keep the lid on, in all fairness. But I believe you can coddle this guy Milosevic a little too much, and I think it's time to get stern with this man. I would just like to recommend to the chairman and distinguished leaders of this committee to look at the matter of independence. I believe there is no other answer, because ethnic Albanians will not accept anything else, and I believe if there's to be a tempest in this teapot, we should deal with it now.